The wind howled a lonely song across the endless plains of Montana, kicking up swirling clouds of dust that coated everything in a fine, gritty layer. The sun beat down relentlessly, a merciless white orb in a pale blue sky. For Sarah O'Connell, this land, once her family's pride, now felt like a prison. The O'Connell Ranch was a shadow of its former self. The fences sagged, the barn roof was patched with old tin sheets, and the once robust herd of cattle was now a pitifully small group of scrawny animals huddled in the shade of a skeletal water tower. Inside the dusty two-room cabin, Sarah sat at a worn-down wooden table, a stack of overdue bills spread out before her like a deck of bad cards. Each one was a fresh stab of despair. Her hands, calloused and rough from years of ranch work, trembled as she held a foreclosure notice from the bank in town. The ink was bold, unforgiving. Final notice. Foreclosure proceedings begin in 30 days. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of failure. She had promised her late husband Thomas that she would never let the ranch go. She had sworn to him on his deathbed that she would protect it for their daughter, Maggie. Now, she was failing. A soft voice from the doorway pulled her from her bleak thoughts. "Mama, are you all right?" Maggie, 16 years old, stood there, her long brown hair tied back in a simple braid. Her eyes, the same warm hazel as her father's, were filled with a concern that was far too old for her years. She saw the papers on the table and the despair on her mother's face. "I'm fine, sweetie," Sarah said, her voice a little too sharp. She quickly gathered the papers, her movements clumsy. "Just thinking." Maggie didn't need to see the papers to know what they were. She had seen the worried lines on her mother's face deepen with each passing week. She walked over and put a hand on her mother's shoulder. It was a gesture of quiet support, a silent acknowledgement of their shared burden. "Mr. Thorne was here again," Maggie said softly. Silas Thorne. The name was a curse on their lips. The land baron who was systematically buying up every struggling ranch in the county. His men had been riding by more frequently, their presence a predatory shadow. Sarah's jaw tightened. "What did he say this time?" "He told me to tell you that he's ready to make a final offer. Said it would be a shame to see such a fine piece of land go to waste." Sarah scoffed, a bitter sound. He didn't want the land to go to waste. He wanted it for his own sprawling empire. Thorne's ranch already bordered theirs on 3 sides. This was the final piece of his puzzle. "He's a vulture," Sarah said, her voice laced with venom. "I know, Mama," Maggie replied, "but what are we going to do? We can't keep this up much longer." A heavy silence filled the small room, broken only by the mournful groaning of the wind outside. Sarah looked at her daughter, at her young, hopeful face, and felt a fierce, protective love surge through her. She couldn't let Silas Thorne win. She had to find a way. Any way. Later that afternoon, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It wasn't Thorne's men. Sarah recognized the solitary rider, his silhouette stark against the setting sun. John Jack Carter. He was their closest neighbor, a man of quiet strength and a reputation for being fiercely honest. His ranch, the Lazy J, was one of the most successful in the valley, a testament to his hard work and dedication. He had been a friend to Thomas and a kind, distant presence since Thomas's death. Jack rode up to the fence and dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. He was a tall man, weathered by the sun and wind, with kind eyes that seemed to hold the weight of a silent understanding. He led his horse, a sturdy bay gelding, to the trough and gave it some water before approaching the porch where Sarah and Maggie sat. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Maggie, good afternoon." "Jack," Sarah replied, a knot of nervousness tightening in her stomach. She knew why he was here. He had seen the foreclosure notice in the newspaper. Everyone had. He took off his dusty hat, revealing a shock of sun-streaked brown hair. "I came to talk about the ranch." Sarah braced herself. "There's nothing to talk about, Jack. We'll figure something out." "Silas Thorne is making an offer," he stated, his eyes steady. Sarah bit back a sharp retort. "I know. He's a snake, Sarah. He'll lowball you, and then when he has you backed into a corner, he'll take everything for pennies on the dollar." "I know that too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But I don't have a choice. Jack looked out across the dry, cracked land. Yes, you do, I'll buy it. Sarah's breath hitched. She looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. What? I'll buy the ranch, he repeated. I'll give you a fair price, enough to pay off your debts and give you a fresh start somewhere else. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her, followed by a fierce, bitter shame. A fair price. He wasn't trying to take advantage of her. He was trying to save them. But the thought of selling her home, Thomas's legacy, was a knife to her heart. She thought of the years of struggle, the sacrifices, the promises she had made. And then, in a moment of utter desperation, a thought so wild and reckless, so far-fetched, took hold of her. It was a desperate gamble, a last painful throw of the dice. The price of the ranch is too high, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at Maggie, who was listening intently, her face a mixture of hope and fear. And then she looked at Jack, at his honest, unwavering gaze. But my daughter, Maggie, she is at your disposal. The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Jack's face, usually a mask of calm, registered a flicker of disbelief, then a deep, pained disappointment. He looked from Sarah to Maggie, who had gone pale, her eyes wide with a combination of confusion and horror. A silent, agonizing moment passed between them. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the yard, turning the dust into a golden haze. The wind continued its mournful cry. Sarah watched Jack, her heart in her throat, praying he would understand the desperation that had led her to say something so unthinkable. The price of the ranch was not just land and buildings, it was their very lives, their future. And in that moment she had offered the one thing more precious than all of it, to save the rest. A tense silence fell over the yard, thick with the weight of Sarah's words. Jack Carter stood motionless, his hat held loosely in his hand, a statue carved from disbelief. His steady gaze, which had always been so open and honest, now held a deep, unreadable expression as it shifted from Sarah to Maggie. Maggie, still and pale, looked as if she had been struck. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, shame, horror, and a profound misunderstanding. Finally, Jack moved. He placed his hat back on his head with a slow, deliberate motion. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, pained rumble, "I came here to offer you a way out, to help you, not to—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the accusation. The thought that she would offer her own daughter was unthinkable, a desperate act he couldn't comprehend. A hot flush of shame spread across Sarah's face. She knew how it sounded. She had meant it as a way to convey the true, immeasurable value of the ranch, that only something equally valuable could be exchanged for it. But her words had been twisted by her own desperation into something sordid and monstrous. "Jack, I didn't mean—" she began, her voice cracking. "It's just that this ranch is everything to us. It's my husband's legacy, it's all we have. The price, it's not just money, it's our future." Maggie, her voice small and trembling, finally spoke. "Mama, what did you mean?" Sarah couldn't look her daughter in the eye. The shame was too great. She had put her own child in an impossible position. She had exposed their private pain and a level of desperation that was terrifying. Jack, seeing the distress on both of their faces, stepped in. His eyes, though still pained, softened. He was a man of the land, accustomed to dealing with hardships and harsh realities. He had seen the toll that a life of struggle took on people. He understood desperation, even if he didn't condone this particular expression of it. "I understand," he said, his voice calmer now. "The weight you carry. It's more than any person should have to bear alone. But what you said, Sarah, that's not the way. A person's worth can't be measured in acres of land, and a life can't be traded like livestock." He paused, letting his words sink in. Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. The shame of her outburst was now replaced by a profound sense of regret. She had insulted him, their kind neighbor, and put her daughter through an unspeakable moment of horror. "I am sorry, Jack," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I am so sorry. I didn't mean it that way. I was desperate." Jack nodded, accepting her apology without hesitation. "I know. Desperation can make you say things you don't mean. He looked at Maggie, a flicker of something close to paternal concern in his eyes. "Maggie, you heard me. That's not the deal. Not ever." Maggie simply stared at him, unable to speak, the relief warring with the lingering fear. Jack's gaze returned to Sarah. "I'm still offering to help. I'll buy the ranch, and you can start over." "And if I don't want to sell?" Sarah asked, her voice firming slightly. The desperate act had been a mistake, but it had also hardened her resolve. She wouldn't give up. Jack's expression was thoughtful. He looked around the dusty, dilapidated yard, his eyes taking in the broken-down wagon, the rust-eaten windmill, the exhausted state of the property. "Then you'll lose it to Thorne, and he won't be as kind as I am." "What if there's another way?" she said, a new idea forming in her mind. One that was less desperate, more honorable. What if you don't buy the ranch, but you help us save it? We can work for you, Maggie and I. We can work off the debt. A loan, no interest, just the price of the land paid back in labor. Jack considered this. It was a risky proposition. She had no collateral, and the ranch was a money pit. But he saw the fire in her eyes, the fierce determination. It wasn't about the money for her. It was about pride. It was about keeping her husband's dream alive. "That's a lot of work, Sarah," he said slowly. "My ranch, it's not easy work. It's hard, and it's long days. Do you really think you two can handle it?" "We'll do whatever it takes," Sarah said, her voice laced with a renewed sense of purpose. "We'll work sunup to sundown, whatever you need." Jack looked at Maggie. Her small frame seemed to hold a world of responsibility. He saw the same determination in her eyes as in her mother's. He had seen the kind of strength that came from a difficult life, and these two women had it in spades. He sighed, a long, tired sound. "All right," he said. "Here's the deal. I'll give you the loan. You'll work at my ranch, the Lazy J, until the debt is paid. The amount of the loan will be the price of what the ranch is worth, which I'll have appraised. We'll deduct your labor from the total until it's paid off. If you quit, the land is mine. No questions asked. And if you get to the point where you don't think you can do it, I'll still be here to buy the land from you. But you won't lose it to Thorne." Sarah's shoulders slumped with relief. It was an overwhelming offer, a true act of charity and faith in them. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you so much." Maggie simply nodded, a single, silent tear of relief rolling down her cheek. The unspoken nightmare of her mother's offer was finally dissipating, replaced by the daunting but honorable reality of hard work. Jack nodded, a small, tired smile on his lips. "We'll start tomorrow morning. I'll have a wagon for you to haul your things. Don't worry about the horses. I'll have my men come and get them." He turned and walked back to his horse, the dust settling around his feet. He mounted with a practiced ease, his silhouette once again a lone figure against the fiery sunset. As he rode away, Sarah and Maggie stood on the porch, watching him go. The silent, tense air had been replaced by a fragile sense of hope. The future was still uncertain, and the work ahead of them was monumental. But for the first time in a long time, they had a chance. The next morning the sun rose, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink. Sarah and Maggie were up before it, the air cool and crisp, with the promise of a long, hot day ahead. They had spent the night packing their few belongings into worn-out saddlebags and a couple of old trunks. The house felt empty, hollowed out by their departure. Every item they left behind was a memory of Thomas and a life that was now lost. As the first rays of light slanted across the dusty yard, Jack's foreman, a grizzled old man named Hank, arrived with a large wagon. Hank had worked for Jack's family for decades and was a man of few words but profound loyalty. He tipped his hat to Sarah and Maggie. "Morning, Ma'am. Mr. Carter sent me to get you." Sarah nodded, a lump in her throat. She gestured to the trunks. "These are all we have." Hank, without a word, began loading their belongings into the wagon. Maggie held a small faded photograph of her father, his smile wide and warm. She tucked it carefully into her satchel. It was the only tangible piece of him she was taking with her. The ride to the Lazy J ranch was quiet, filled with the rumbling of the wagon wheels and the low groan of the springs. The road, which had always been so familiar, now felt strange, a path leading to an unknown future. As they drew closer to the Lazy J, Sarah and Maggie were struck by the difference. The fences were neat and sturdy, the pastures were green with well-tended grass, and the barn was a large, well-maintained structure. It was a stark contrast to their own failing ranch. Jack was waiting for them when they arrived. He stood beside the main house, a large two-story structure made of timber and stone, a testament to generations of hard work. He was wearing a plain work shirt and denim trousers, his boots scuffed and dusty. He looked the part of a rancher, rugged and capable. "Welcome," he said, his voice a quiet greeting. "Hank will show you where you'll be staying." He pointed to a small two-room cabin a little ways from the main house. It was clean and tidy, with a small porch and a well-kept yard. "It's not much," he said, "but it's yours for as long as you're here. There's a small kitchen and 2 beds. Sarah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. It was more than she had expected. She had been prepared to sleep in the bunkhouse or even the barn. This was a kindness she didn't know how to repay. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "This is very kind of you." He just nodded. "Get settled. We'll eat in an hour. We'll talk about the work then." He turned and walked away, a man of action rather than words. The cabin, while small, was a refuge. The wooden floors were clean, and the windows, though small, let in plenty of light. They unpacked their few possessions, arranging them carefully. Maggie placed the photograph of her father on a small rickety nightstand. For the first time since their ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope. They were safe here, for now. That evening they ate dinner at the main house. The dining room was large and cozy, with a big fireplace and a long, polished wooden table. Jack sat at the head of the table, and the few ranch hands, rugged and silent men, sat scattered around. The food was simple but plentiful, a hearty beef stew, fresh bread and beans. The meal was quiet. The men ate with the easy familiarity of a family, and Sarah and Maggie were simply observers. After they finished, Jack cleared his throat. "I'll be paying you a wage for your work," he said, addressing Sarah. "It will be deducted from your debt. The loan is for 50 acres, and the house, which has been valued at a fair market price of $5,000. The wage for your work will be deducted from that total." Sarah nodded. $5,000. It was an enormous sum, one she could never have hoped to earn on her own. But a wage, even if it was just for labor, was something she could work toward. "As for the work," Jack continued, "you'll be working on the ranch side by side with the rest of us. We need to mend fences, brand cattle, and get the hay in. Maggie," he said, turning to her, "you'll be working with the horses. We have a lot of new colts that need to be broken. You have a knack with horses, don't you?" Maggie, who had been quietly listening, looked up, surprised. She had always had a way with animals, a quiet empathy that seemed to calm even the wildest horse. She had spent countless hours with their own small herd, whispering to them, grooming them. "Yes, sir," she said softly. A small smile touched Jack's lips. "Good. Then you'll be a great help. Sarah, you'll be working with the cattle and with Hank. He'll show you what needs to be done." The next morning, Sarah and Maggie began their new life. Sarah, despite her years of ranch work, felt the strain of the physical labor. Her muscles ached, and her hands, already calloused, became raw and sore. But she pushed through the pain, fueled by her determination. She worked alongside Hank, mending fences and hauling hay. The work was endless, but with each fence post she set, with each bale of hay she stacked, she felt a small sense of accomplishment. Maggie, on the other hand, found her element with the horses. She spent her days in the corral, a quiet, gentle presence among the skittish colts. She would speak to them in a soft, soothing voice, her hands gentle as she coaxed them into accepting the bit and bridle. Jack would often watch her, a quiet look of admiration on his face. He saw in her the same quiet strength he had seen in her mother. As the days turned into weeks, a quiet rhythm settled over their lives. The pain of leaving their home was still there, a dull ache in their hearts, but it was slowly being replaced by the satisfaction of hard work and the growing sense of purpose. They were not just surviving, they were building a new life. And in the quiet evenings, as the sun set in a blaze of color, they would sit on the porch of their small cabin, looking out at the vast expanse of the Lazy J, and for the first time in a long time, they felt a fragile sense of peace. Life on the Lazy J ranch quickly settled into a demanding routine. The days began at the first hint of dawn, with the crisp morning air filled with the sounds of mooing cattle and the distant clanging of a blacksmith's hammer. The work was relentless and unforgiving, but for Sarah and Maggie, it was a welcome distraction from the weight of their debt and the constant threat of Silas Thorne. Sarah, despite her age, proved to be a tireless worker. Hank, initially skeptical of a woman's ability to handle the heavy labor, quickly grew to respect her quiet determination. She learned to mend fences with a speed and efficiency that surprised even the seasoned ranch hands. Her hands, though perpetually sore and calloused, moved with a purpose that spoke of a deep-seated need to save her family and her home. She and Hank, a man of few words, formed a silent, respectful partnership, communicating more with nods and grunts than with actual conversation. Maggie, meanwhile, flourished. Her intuitive connection with horses was a rare gift. The skittish colts, which had resisted the attempts of other ranch hands, seemed to calm in her presence. She spent her days in the corral, her voice a soft murmur as she gentled the young horses. Jack often watched her from a distance, a quiet, almost paternal pride in his eyes. He saw the genuine love she had for the animals, a bond that was born not of training, but of pure empathy. She had a way of reading their emotions, of understanding their fears, and her gentle touch was all the reassurance they needed. Despite the grueling schedule, they found a quiet comfort in their new home. The small cabin, once so empty, was now filled with the warmth of their shared life. They would spend their evenings on the small porch, watching the stars blaze across the ink-black sky, a silence of a different kind between them now, one of companionship, not despair. But the peace was fragile. The shadow of Silas Thorne loomed large, a constant menacing presence. He was a man who saw land not as a home, but as a commodity to be hoarded. He had been a ruthless businessman, and he didn't take kindly to being denied. One afternoon, as Sarah and Hank were mending a section of fence on the far side of the property, a rider approached. It was one of Thorne's men, a tall, lanky man with a cruel smirk on his face. Sarah's stomach tightened. "Morning, ma'am," the man said, his voice a low sneer. "Heard you were working for Carter now. Guess you couldn't stand up on your own 2 feet, huh?" Sarah ignored him, her hands still busy with the wire. Hank, however, straightened up, his hand resting on the handle of his hammer. "You got business here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The man's smirk widened. "Just passing through. But I got a message for your boss. Tell him Thorne ain't forgotten about that ranch. He'll get it one way or another." "You tell Thorne to get off our land," Hank growled. "This is Carter's property. You got no business here." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "This ranch, that land, it's all going to be Thorne's soon enough. You can't outrun him, ma'am. He always gets what he wants." With that, the man spurred his horse and rode away, the dust he kicked up a symbol of his contempt. Sarah watched him go, a shiver running down her spine. The threat was clear. Thorne wasn't just interested in the ranch, he was interested in her failure. She and Hank finished the fence in a heavy silence. The peace of their afternoon was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. When Jack returned from town later that day, Hank told him about the visit. Jack's face tightened into a hard mask. "He's just trying to rattle you," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew Silas Thorne was a man of his word, and his word was a promise of destruction. "He's not going to stop," Sarah said, her voice small. "He'll do anything to get that land." "Then we'll be ready for him," Jack said, his gaze meeting hers. "We'll put up a fight he won't soon forget." His words, though a comfort, did little to ease her mind. She knew Thorne's methods were ruthless, and she feared what he might do. Her mind replayed the words of the man. "He always gets what he wants." Later that evening, Maggie found her mother sitting on the porch, staring out at the fading light. "Are you all right, Mama?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet concern. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I'm just tired, honey, and I'm scared. I don't know what Thorne will do." Maggie sat beside her, her small hand finding her mother's. "We'll face it together. He can't hurt us as long as we have each other." Sarah looked at her daughter, at her brave, young face. Maggie was no longer the frightened girl she had been that day on the porch. The hard work had given her a new sense of purpose and a strength that was both humbling and inspiring. "You're right," Sarah said, a renewed sense of resolve washing over her. She would not let Thorne win. She would not let him take what was rightfully theirs, not after all they had sacrificed. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to appear one by one. The air grew cool and still. But the peace of the night was tinged with the knowledge that a storm was coming. Silas Thorne was like the dust devil that twisted across the plains, unseen but powerful and capable of tearing apart everything in its path. And they were standing directly in its way. The threat of Silas Thorne became more than just a passing shadow. It became a tangible presence, a constant pressure on their lives. Thorne's men began to ride the fence line of the Lazy J more frequently, their presence a silent, menacing reminder of his ambition. They were never overtly aggressive, but their eyes held a cold, predatory gleam that was hard to ignore. Jack Carter, ever the pragmatist, responded with a quiet but firm resolve. He increased the number of patrols on the perimeter of his ranch, and he had his men, including Sarah, keep a constant watch. The atmosphere at the Lazy J, once a place of quiet industry, was now filled with a low hum of tension. One morning, Sarah and Maggie were at the corral, and Maggie was working with a young colt. The horse was particularly skittish, but Maggie's gentle patience was slowly winning it over. Suddenly, a man on horseback appeared at the fence line. It was Silas Thorne himself. He was a large man, his girth straining the buttons of his tailored suit, his face a fleshy mask of entitlement. He rode a magnificent black stallion, a stark contrast to the workhorses on the ranch. Jack, who had been watching from the barn, walked toward him, his face a hard, unyielding mask. "Thorne," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're on my land." Thorne smiled, a chilling expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a neighborly visit, Carter. I was just marveling at how you've taken to hiring women to do a man's work. I've always said it's a desperate man who has to resort to desperate measures." Sarah's face flushed with anger, and Maggie took a protective step closer to her mother. Jack's hands clenched into fists at his side. "The work gets done, Thorne. That's all that matters." "I'm sure it does," Thorne said, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with a proprietary air. "But I didn't come here to talk about your hired help. I came here to talk about that worthless O'Connell property. The land is mine, Carter. You know it. It's just a matter of time. I can make it easy on you both, or I can make it very, very hard." "It's not for sale," Jack said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Everything has a price, Carter, and you're a fool for trying to stand in my way. This is my valley. I've earned every acre of it." "You've taken every acre of it," Jack shot back, his eyes narrowing. "There's a difference between earning and stealing." Thorne's smile vanished. His face darkened. "You're a proud man, Carter, but pride is a luxury you can't afford. You're holding on to a worthless piece of land for a woman who was desperate enough to sell her own daughter. Do you think that's a secret that's going to stay buried for long?" The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had feared this, that the secret of her desperate offer would be used against them. She felt a wave of shame and humiliation wash over her. Jack, sensing her distress, stepped in front of her, shielding her from Thorne's malicious gaze. "Leave here, Thorne," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Now, before I forget my manners." Thorne's eyes flickered from Jack to Sarah. "Remember what I said, Carter. I'm a patient man, but my patience has its limits. The O'Connell ranch will be mine." With a final, chilling glance, he turned his horse and rode away. A heavy silence fell over the ranch. Sarah felt the weight of Thorne's words, his accusation a fresh wound. She turned to Jack, her eyes filled with a mixture of apology and despair. "He knows," she whispered. "It doesn't matter," Jack said, his voice firm. "What happened on that porch stays between us. It's our secret. Thorne is just a man with a big mouth and no heart." But it did matter. Thorne's words had a power of their own. The unspoken truth of her desperation had been exposed, a vulnerability that he would use against them. That night, as Sarah and Maggie sat on the porch of their cabin, the air felt different. The quiet companionship of their evenings was now tinged with a new anxiety. "Mama," Maggie said softly, "is it true, what he said? Did you really—" Sarah closed her eyes, a fresh wave of shame washing over her. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I was so desperate. I don't know what I was thinking. I was just trying to save our home." Maggie was silent for a long moment. Then she reached out and took her mother's hand. "I understand, Mama," she said, her voice filled with a maturity that broke Sarah's heart. "I'm not mad. I know how much that ranch meant to you. It was Father's legacy." Sarah looked at her daughter, tears welling in her eyes. "You're so much stronger than I am, Maggie." "No," Maggie said, a small smile touching her lips. "I just have you to be strong for." The next few days were difficult. The work continued, but the air was heavy with the unspoken threat of Thorne. Jack, a man who was always in control, seemed to be constantly on edge. He kept a closer watch on his property, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. One afternoon, a small fire broke out in one of the fields, a small but deliberate fire that threatened to spread to the barn. It was quickly extinguished, but the message was clear. Thorne was escalating his tactics. He wasn't just interested in talking, he was interested in destroying. The reality of their situation had become a harsh truth. The debt was not just a number on a piece of paper, it was a race against time. They had to pay it off before Thorne could find a way to take the land from them, and Thorne was not above playing dirty. The storm was no longer gathering, it was here, and they were caught in the middle of it. The fire, though quickly contained, served as a stark reminder of the escalating conflict. Jack, seeing the calculated threat, doubled down on his efforts to secure the ranch. He hired 2 extra hands, old friends of his, and had them patrol the perimeter day and night. The men, seasoned and loyal, brought a sense of security to the ranch, but the air remained thick with tension. Silas Thorne, a master of psychological warfare, didn't let up. He had his men ride the fence line at all hours, their presence a constant source of unease. He sent anonymous letters to the town's newspaper, hinting at a scandal involving a desperate widow and a morally questionable deal with a wealthy rancher. The whispers in town began to grow, and Jack's reputation, once pristine, was now being questioned. Sarah felt the weight of the rumors. She saw the glances from the townsfolk when she and Maggie went to the general store. The smiles were a little less warm, the conversations a little more strained. The shame of her past desperation was now a public spectacle, and it pained her to see Jack's name dragged through the mud because of her. One evening, after a long day of working the cattle, Sarah found Jack sitting on the porch of the main house, his face grim. She hesitated, then walked over and sat beside him. "I'm sorry, Jack," she said softly. "This is my fault. All of it. The rumors, Thorne's threats. If I had just sold the ranch to him, none of this would be happening." Jack looked at her, his eyes weary. "You think that's what he wants, Sarah? He doesn't want the land. Not just the land. He wants to own you. He wants to own everyone he can, to prove that he's a bigger man than everyone else. This isn't about the ranch, it's about pride. And he's a man who has a lot of it." "But he's using my desperation against you," she insisted. "He's trying to ruin your name." "My name can't be ruined by a man like Thorne," Jack said, his voice firm. "People who know me know the truth, and the people who don't, well, their opinions don't matter much to me." "It matters to me," Sarah said, a lump in her throat. "You've been so kind to us, and I've brought you nothing but trouble." Jack sighed, a long, tired sound. "Sarah, you and Maggie have brought a lot to this ranch. Maggie's a natural with the horses. She's got a way with them I haven't seen in a long time. And you're the hardest worker I've ever met. We're a team now. We'll face this together." His words were a comfort, a lifeline in the sea of her guilt. She realized then that their arrangement was no longer a simple business transaction. It was a partnership forged in adversity, a silent promise to stand together against a common enemy. The next day, as they worked on a cattle drive, one of the ranch hands, a young man named Tom, approached Jack. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low. "I hear some talk in town about how you're using a woman and her girl to get a piece of land on the cheap." Jack's jaw tightened, but his voice was calm. "And what did you tell them, Tom?" "I told them to mind their own business, sir. But it's not just talk. Thorne's men are spreading it all over town." "Let them talk," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "What's the price of a man's reputation if it can be bought and sold with a few whispers? The truth, Tom, is that Sarah and her daughter are working for me to pay off their debt. I'm not taking their land. They're saving it. And I'm proud to have them as part of my crew." The young man nodded, a look of respect on his face. He returned to his work, but his words hung in the air, a testament to the difficult battle they were fighting. Maggie, too, was a subject of the rumors. She heard them from the other ranch hands, who, to their credit, were protective of her. They would often tell her that the townsfolk were just jealous of her ability with horses, but the words still stung. She was no longer just the rancher's daughter. She was the girl who had been offered as a payment for her home. The trust that was slowly building between them was a fragile thing. Jack's unwavering belief in them, his refusal to be swayed by Thorne's lies, was the foundation of that trust. He was a man of his word, a man who saw honor in a world that was becoming increasingly devoid of it. Sarah, in turn, began to trust him implicitly. She saw his quiet strength, his unwavering morality. She saw how he treated his men, how he cared for his land, and how he protected her and her daughter from the viciousness of the world. He was not just their boss, he was their protector. The long road to trust was paved with hard work and shared adversity. They were no longer just two people working toward a common goal. They were a family of sorts, bound by a debt of honor and a mutual respect. The storm was raging around them, but in the heart of the Lazy J, they had found a quiet harbor of safety and a growing sense of belonging. The fight was far from over, but for the first time they felt they had a chance to win. With the passing weeks, a different kind of relationship began to form between Sarah, Maggie, and Jack. It was a silent, unspoken bond forged in the crucible of shared labor and common enemies. The initial awkwardness had faded, replaced by a comfortable rhythm. They still kept to themselves in the evenings, but during the day they worked as a seamless team. Sarah and Jack often found themselves working side by side, mending fences or wrangling cattle. Their conversations were sparse but meaningful, a mix of practical ranch talk and quiet observations about the world around them. Sarah, once so withdrawn and consumed by her own despair, began to see Jack not just as her benefactor, but as a man of quiet depth and unwavering character. She saw the way he handled his men with respect and fairness, and the way he cared for his land, with a profound love for the soil. One afternoon, as they were herding a group of strays back to the main herd, a calf got spooked and ran off. Jack and Sarah rode after it, the wind whipping past them. Sarah's horse stumbled, and she was nearly thrown from the saddle. Jack was there in an instant, his hand on her arm, steadying her. "You all right, Sarah?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of concern. "I'm fine," she said, her heart hammering in her chest. "Just a little clumsy." He didn't say anything, but his eyes held a look of quiet admiration. "You're not clumsy, Sarah. You're just tired. This kind of work takes its toll." He didn't just see her as a worker. He saw her as a person. It was a small but profound gesture of kindness that touched her deeply. Maggie, meanwhile, was thriving under Jack's tutelage. He saw her natural ability with horses and began to teach her more advanced skills. He showed her how to read a horse's body language, how to anticipate its movements, and how to build a bond based on trust and respect, not fear. Maggie, in turn, began to see him as a mentor and a friend. She would spend hours with him in the corral talking about the horses and sometimes about her father. One day, as they were working with a particularly spirited Mustang, Maggie confided in him. "My father, he loved horses. He always said they were the most honest creatures on the planet. They don't lie, they just are." Jack nodded, a small smile on his lips. He was a wise man, and he raised a wise daughter. The compliment, so simple and sincere, meant the world to Maggie. It was a validation of her father's memory and of her own abilities. She had always felt a sense of pride in her connection to her father, and Jack's acknowledgement of that connection made her feel a little less alone. The bond between them was growing, a fragile, unspoken thing that was slowly replacing the transactional nature of their agreement. They were no longer just a struggling widow and her daughter and a kind-hearted rancher. They were people who were learning to trust each other, to rely on each other. But the peace was short-lived. The storm of Silas Thorne was building, and he was not a man to be trifled with. One evening, after a particularly long day, a small fire broke out in the barn. It was quickly extinguished, but the message was clear. Thorne was no longer content with just threats. He was escalating his campaign of terror. The men on the ranch, though loyal, were on edge. They had seen Thorne's ruthlessness before, and they knew he was a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Jack, ever the calm in the storm, gathered his men and gave them a simple instruction. We will not be provoked. We will not be bullied. We will continue to do our work. And we will keep a close eye on everything. We will not give Thorne a single reason to come here. His words were a comfort, but the fear was palpable. Sarah and Maggie knew that the debt they were working to pay off was no longer just a financial one. It was a debt of survival, and Thorne was making it clear that he would not rest until they were all broken. That night, as the full moon cast a silver glow over the ranch, Sarah sat on her porch, a rifle cradled in her arms. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a protector. She was ready to fight for her land, for her daughter, and for the man who had given them a second chance. The fragile bond that had formed between them was now a line in the sand, and they were ready to defend it. Thorne's harassment intensified, a slow, methodical tightening of the noose. It wasn't just small acts of arson anymore. His men began to cut fences, a deliberate act of sabotage designed to let Jack's cattle wander and get lost. It was a costly and time-consuming problem, forcing the crew to spend days on horseback, rounding up the scattered herd. One day they found a small group of Thorne's men rustling a few of Jack's prize steers. A tense standoff ensued. Jack, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, faced them down. "You turn those cattle back," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "or we're going to have a problem." Thorne's foreman, a burly, scarred man named Jed, laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you can stop us, Carter? Thorne said to get 'em, and we're going to get 'em." "These cattle are marked with my brand," Jack said. "They're my property. You're stealing." "Call it what you want," Jed sneered. "Thorne says your time is coming, Carter. The O'Connell Ranch is going to be his, and all of this is just the down payment." Jack stood his ground, his eyes unblinking. "You have 10 seconds to turn those steers back and get off my land. After that, I won't be responsible for what happens next." The threat was clear. Jack was a man of peace, but he was also a man who would defend what was his. Jed, seeing the cold resolve in his eyes, hesitated. He knew Jack's reputation. He was a formidable opponent. With a final, venomous glare, Jed and his men turned the cattle around and rode away, defeated for now. The incident was a victory, but it was a small one. It was a clear sign that Thorne was not going to stop. He was testing their resolve, pushing them to their breaking point. Sarah watched the entire confrontation from a distance, her heart in her throat. She saw Jack's quiet strength, his willingness to stand up to a bully. She saw a man who would not back down, a man who would defend not just his own property, but her honor as well. That night, as they sat on the porch, the air was heavy with the day's events. Sarah finally spoke. "He's not going to stop, is he?" she said, her voice filled with a quiet despair. "No," Jack admitted. "He's a man who thrives on conflict. He won't rest until he's broken us." "So what do we do?" Maggie asked, her voice small. "We keep working," Jack said, his voice firm. "We show him that we won't be broken. We show him that we are stronger than he thinks." His words were a source of strength, but the reality of their situation was a constant weight. The debt was a monumental sum, and the sabotage was making their work even harder. The progress they were making was slow, painfully so. Thorne, in his relentless pursuit, began to use their vulnerability against them. He had his men ride by when Maggie was alone, and their crude remarks were designed to frighten her. Maggie, who had always been a quiet, gentle girl, was now forced to be brave. She held her head high, her eyes steady, and she refused to let them see her fear. Sarah, seeing her daughter's quiet strength, felt a fierce sense of pride. Maggie was no longer a child. She was a woman, forged in the fires of adversity. She was a survivor. The constant pressure began to take its toll. The ranch hands, though loyal, were on edge. The fear of what Thorne might do next was a constant presence, and the financial strain was immense. Jack was losing money to the sabotage, and the debt was still a long way from being paid off. One afternoon, Jack found Sarah sitting on the porch, her head in her hands. She looked exhausted, defeated. He sat beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. "Sarah," he said softly, "are you all right?" "I don't know, Jack," she confessed. "I'm just so tired. I feel like we're fighting a losing battle. The debt is so big, and he's just so relentless." "We're not losing," Jack said, his voice firm. "We're not. Look at all we've accomplished. Look at Maggie. She's not afraid of him, and look at you. You're fighting with everything you have." He was right. They had accomplished so much. They had a home, a fragile but real sense of security, and a growing bond of trust. And they had each other. I don't want to lose this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to lose this home." "You won't," Jack promised. "I won't let you." His words, a simple promise, were all the reassurance she needed. The fight was far from over, but she knew that as long as they were together, they would be able to withstand anything that Thorne could throw at them. The test of their resolve was not a single battle. It was a long, unending war. And they were ready to fight it. The relentless pressure from Silas Thorne's campaign of intimidation began to take its toll, not just on the land and the livestock, but on the people themselves. The exhaustion was a constant companion, a heavy blanket that settled over the ranch. But amidst the hardship, a different kind of growth was happening. The shared struggle was forging a bond between Sarah and Jack that was deeper and more nuanced than either of them could have anticipated. The unspoken trust that had been slowly building between them was now becoming a tangible, powerful force. They had fallen into a comfortable routine of working together, a silent understanding passing between them with a look or a gesture. They were no longer just a woman and a man. They were partners, two halves of a whole united in their purpose. One sweltering afternoon, they were working together to mend a fence line that had been deliberately cut. The sun beat down on them, and the dust fine as powder coated their faces. As they worked, their hands would sometimes brush against each other, a brief, fleeting touch that would send a jolt of electricity through Sarah. She would quickly pull her hand away, a blush rising to her cheeks, but she knew that Jack had felt it too. He would often talk to her about the history of the Lazy J, about his grandfather who had built the first cabin, and his father who had expanded the herd. He spoke of the land with a reverence that she understood completely. He was not just a rancher, he was a steward of the land, a guardian of his family's legacy. She, in turn, began to open up to him about her life with Thomas. She told him stories of their early years, of their dreams for the ranch and of the happy life they had built together. She spoke of her love for the land and of her promise to her late husband. She was no longer just the grieving widow. She was a woman with a past, a present, and a hope for a future. Their conversations were quiet and intimate, filled with a deep respect for each other. They were two people who had been alone for a long time, and they had found in each other a solace they hadn't known they were missing. Maggie, too, was a witness to this growing connection. She would often see them talking in hushed tones, a comfortable silence falling between them, and she would feel a sense of peace. She saw the way Jack looked at her mother, with a kindness and admiration that her father had always shown her, and she saw the way her mother, who had been so consumed by grief, was now slowly, tentatively, beginning to live again. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of color, Maggie found her mother on the porch, a thoughtful look on her face. "Mama," she said softly, "you and Mr. Carter, are you—" Sarah looked at her daughter, a faint blush on her cheeks. "Are we what, honey?" "Are you happy?" Maggie asked. Sarah thought for a moment. Happy was a big word. It was a word that she hadn't dared to use in a long time. But as she looked at her daughter and thought about the day she had spent with Jack, she felt a small, unfamiliar warmth in her heart. "I am at peace," she said, her voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "He's a good man, Maggie. He's an honorable man. And he's a good friend." Maggie nodded, a small smile on her face. She knew her mother was being careful with her words, But she also knew that there was something more there, something that was a quiet promise of a future that was no longer just about survival. But the future was still uncertain. The storm was building, and Thorne was not a man to be underestimated. One day, a man from Thorne's ranch came to the Lazy J with a letter from Thorne himself. It was a formal legal document, a new offer to buy the ranch, but with a new, even lower price. It was a final insult, a final attempt to break them. Jack read the letter, his face grim. He crumpled the paper in his fist, the sound a sharp, angry crackle. "He's not going to stop until he gets it," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We keep working," Jack said, his voice firm. "We show him that his money, his threats, and his endless lies, they mean nothing to us. We show him that we are stronger together." The words were a testament to the trust that had been forged between them. They were no longer two separate entities, but one. The whispers of trust had become a shield, a silent promise to stand together against the storm. The fight for the ranch was not just a fight for land anymore. It was a fight for their dignity, for their honor, and for the fragile hope of a future they were building together. The crumpled letter from Silas Thorne lay on the dusty workbench in Jack's barn. It was a tangible representation of the escalating war they were fighting. Jack stood with his hands on his hips, his gaze fixed on the paper as if it were a venomous snake. The new, ridiculously low offer was an insult, a clear signal that Thorne's intentions were purely malicious. He wasn't interested in a fair deal. He was interested in a conquest. Sarah walked in, her face etched with exhaustion. She had been working on the fences all morning, and the sun had been relentless. "Is that from him?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "He's not a man who gives up." "I know," she said. She picked up a worn saddle and began to polish the leather, her movements methodical and calming. "But neither are we. We're getting closer, Jack. I know we are. We've been working so hard." "I know," he said, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as he watched her. "But the sabotage, it's hurting us. We're spending more time fixing what he's broken than we are on the work that really matters. The debt." He trailed off, the number a heavy weight on his tongue. "We'll get there," she said, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. "One day at a time. And we're not alone. The men, they're with you. They see what he's doing. They respect you." Jack looked at her, a flicker of something close to admiration in his eyes. Her unwavering faith was a surprising source of strength for him. He was a man of action, of logic, but she was a woman of hope, and her resilience was as powerful as any physical force. He sat on a hay bale watching her work. "I never thought I'd be fighting a war over a piece of land that isn't even mine." Sarah paused her polishing and looked at him. "It is yours, Jack. In a way, you've given us a home. You've fought for us. That makes it yours, too." The words hung in the air, a silent, unspoken acknowledgement of the deep bond that had formed between them. It was a bond that went beyond business, beyond friendship. It was a bond of shared purpose and quiet affection. Later that evening, as the stars began to appear in the inky sky, Maggie found them on the porch. She had been working with a new colt, and her face was flushed with the heat of the day. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice a little breathless, "I think the little one is ready. He's a good boy. He trusts me." Jack smiled, a rare and genuine expression. "That's wonderful, Maggie. That's a huge accomplishment. You have a real gift." Maggie beamed, her eyes sparkling with pride. "He's not afraid anymore. Not when I'm there. He knows I'm his friend." Jack looked from the girl to her mother. He saw the way Sarah's eyes lit up with pride, and he felt a warmth spread through his chest. He had not just taken in a widow and her daughter, he had taken in a family, and they had brought a sense of life and purpose to his lonely ranch that he hadn't known was missing. The next few days were unusually quiet. The constant threat of Thorne's men seemed to have vanished. The fences were untouched, the fields were undisturbed, and there were no ominous riders on the horizon. The sudden peace was unsettling, like the calm before a storm. Jack knew Thorne was not a man to retreat. He was a man who re-strategized. He spent the days with his men preparing for whatever was to come. They mended every fence, They reinforced the gates, and they kept a constant watch. The tension was palpable, but they were ready. The quiet, however, allowed for a brief moment of normalcy. Maggie took advantage of the calm to spend more time with the horses, her gentle touch a stark contrast to the violence that was brewing. Sarah, with a little less pressure on her shoulders, began to take care of the small garden outside their cabin, planting seeds that she had brought with her. The small acts of defiance, a garden planted in the face of a land baron, a quiet girl taming a wild horse, were more powerful than any weapon. They were acts of hope. They were a testament to their resilience. One evening, as the moon cast a silver glow over the silent fields, Jack sat on the porch of the main house, a rifle cradled in his arms. He watched the lights in the small cabin flicker and then go out. He thought of Sarah, of her quiet strength, and of Maggie, of her gentle spirit. He thought of the land, of the generations that had come before, and the life he was fighting to protect. The calm was a test, a psychological game that Thorne was playing. But Jack was not a man to be trifled with. He was a man of the land, and he knew that every storm, no matter how fierce, eventually passed, and when this one did, he would be standing. He would be standing with the woman who had trusted him with her life, and with the girl who had brought a small piece of light into his world. The war was far from over, but for the first time he knew they would win. The quiet stretched on for almost a week, a tense and nerve-wracking calm that was far worse than the overt threats. Jack knew it was a prelude to something big. Thorne was a snake, and he was biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on a blistering hot afternoon. Jack was out with most of his crew, moving a large herd of cattle to a new pasture on the far side of the ranch. He had left only 2 hands behind, to watch the main house and the corrals, and Hank to oversee the barn. It was a necessary move, as the cattle needed to be moved before the grass was completely gone. But it left the heart of the ranch vulnerable. Sarah and Maggie were in the corrals working with the horses. Maggie was grooming a young colt, her movements slow and soothing, while Sarah was mending a broken gate. The air was thick and still, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Suddenly, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It wasn't the cattle herd. It was Thorne's men, a dozen of them riding hard, their faces grim and their intentions clear. There was no pretense this time. They were here for a fight. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "Maggie," she said, her voice low and urgent, "go to the cabin, now." Maggie looked at her mother, then at the approaching riders, and her face went pale. "Mama, no." "Go," Sarah insisted. "Now. I'll be right behind you." Maggie hesitated for only a moment, then sprinted toward the cabin. Sarah, her hands trembling, grabbed the rifle that was always propped against the barn wall. She had been taught how to shoot by her late husband, Thomas, a long time ago. She wasn't a crack shot, but she knew how to use it. The riders fanned out, surrounding the main ranch. Jed, Thorne's ruthless foreman, dismounted and strode toward the cabin, a menacing smirk on his face. "Get out here, old woman," he sneered. "Thorne wants a word with you." Sarah raised the rifle, her hands steady despite the fear that was a cold knot in her stomach. "You get off this land," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is Carter's property. You have no right to be here." Jed laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Carter's not here, is he? He's off playing cowboy with his cows, leaving you to fend for yourselves." "Fool." He continued to advance, and Sarah, her finger on the trigger, knew she would have to shoot if he got any closer. But just as she was about to pull the trigger, a voice called out from behind him. "That's far enough, Jed." It was Hank. The old foreman had seen the riders and had come out of the barn, a shotgun cradled in his arms. He was old, but he was as steady as a rock. He stood his ground, a silent, formidable presence. Jed's smirk faltered. He had not anticipated a fight. He had been sent to scare them, to destroy a few things, and to send a message, not to engage in a full-blown gunfight. "This ain't your fight, old man," he said. "This is my home," Hank said, his voice a low growl. "And I'll fight for my home." The standoff was tense, a moment suspended in time, but then one of Jed's men spotted something. "Jed," he yelled, pointing. "Look!" A thick, swirling plume of smoke was rising from the direction of the O'Connell ranch. It was an unmistakable signal. Thorne hadn't just sent his men to attack the Lazy J. He had sent another group to burn down the O'Connell ranch. The reality of Thorne's plan was now horribly clear. He was a master of division. He had sent a small group to harass the Lazy J, knowing that Jack would be busy with the cattle. And he had sent another group to destroy the property that was the reason for this whole conflict. Sarah's heart sank. She had been so focused on protecting this new life, this new home, that she had forgotten about her old one. Her home, the place where her husband had lived and died, the place she was fighting so hard to save. Jed, seeing her distress, smiled, a cruel, triumphant expression. "Thorne always gets what he wants, ma'am. He's a patient man. He just waits for the right moment, and now he's got his ranch." Sarah's resolve crumbled. She had lost. The fire, the smoke, the terrible realization of Thorne's true intentions. It was all too much. She lowered her rifle, the weight of her failure heavy in her hands. Hank, seeing her defeat, yelled, "Sarah, no!" But it was too late. The men, sensing her surrender, spurred their horses forward. They were not there to fight. They were there to destroy. They tore through the fences, stomped through the garden that Sarah had so painstakingly planted, and sent a small herd of horses scattering. Sarah watched, her eyes wide with horror. She was a powerless witness to the destruction of the fragile life she had been building. The garden, the fences, the peace they had found, it was all gone. All because she had been so focused on the one thing she couldn't save. The riders, their mission of destruction complete, laughed as they rode away, their jeers a cruel echo of her failure. Sarah stood in the dust, surrounded by the wreckage, the rifle hanging uselessly in her hand. The smoke from her old home was a black smudge on the horizon, a tombstone for her husband's legacy. She had lost, and she had lost everything. The aftermath of Thorne's attack was a scene of utter devastation. The fence that Sarah had worked so hard to mend was torn down, the carefully planted garden was trampled into the dust, and the small herd of horses was scattered across the plains, their terrified neighs echoing in the still air. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, a silent, broken figure. The humiliation and the defeat were a physical pain, a sharp, cold knot in her stomach. Maggie, who had watched the entire scene from the safety of the cabin, ran out to her mother, her eyes wide with fear and tears. "Mama," she whispered, her voice a small, trembling sound. Sarah didn't respond. She just stood there, her gaze fixed on the black plume of smoke on the horizon. The O'Connell ranch, her home, her husband's legacy, was gone. She had lost. She had fought with everything she had, but she had lost. Hank, his face grim, walked over to her. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with a quiet compassion, "we'll fix this. We'll find the horses. We'll rebuild the fences." But Sarah just shook her head, a single, silent tear rolling down her cheek. "It's not about the fences, Hank," she said, her voice hollow. "It's about everything. He won. He always wins." The words were a testament to her utter despair. She had fought so hard, believed so strongly, and in the end, it was all for nothing. Thorne had taken everything from her. He had taken her home, her hope, and her will to fight. When Jack and his crew returned, they found the ranch in ruins. The men dismounted, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. Jack, his face a hard, unyielding mask, walked over to Sarah. He saw the devastation in her eyes, the utter sense of defeat, and his heart sank. He had left her vulnerable, and Thorne had taken advantage of it. The guilt was a heavy weight on his shoulders. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and filled with regret. "I am so sorry. I shouldn't have left you." "It's not your fault, Jack," she said, her voice a whisper. "He always gets what he wants. I should have just sold it to him. I should have saved you from all of this." "No," he said, his voice firm. "You did the right thing. You fought for what was yours. This is on him, not on you." He looked at the smoke still curling in the distance, a dark finger pointing at the sky. He felt a surge of cold fury. Thorne was not just a ruthless businessman, he was a monster. He had gone too far. He had not just destroyed a property, he had broken a woman's spirit. "We will not let him win," Jack said, his voice dangerously low. "We will not let him get away with this." He turned to his men. "Round up the horses," he commanded. "We'll work through the night if we have to. We'll mend the fences. We'll rebuild. We will not give him the satisfaction of seeing us fall." The men, their faces grim, nodded and went to work. They worked through the night, a silent, furious army. Jack worked alongside them, his movements fueled by a cold rage. But he knew that rebuilding the ranch was the easy part. The real work was in rebuilding Sarah's spirit. He found her sitting on the porch of the cabin, a small blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was still and silent, a statue of grief. He sat beside her, a quiet presence in the darkness. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, a silent testament to his support. After a long time, Sarah finally spoke. "It's gone," she said, her voice raw with grief. "Everything. My husband's ranch. It's all gone. And I'm in debt to you for a piece of land that no longer exists." "The land still exists, Sarah," Jack said softly. "The house is gone, but the land is still there, and it's still yours. We'll rebuild. We'll find a way." "What's the point?" she said, her voice filled with a profound sense of futility. "He'll just do it again. He'll just keep coming. He'll never stop." "Then we won't stop either," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "We'll just keep getting stronger, and he'll get tired, or he'll get what's coming to him." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. He saw the despair in her eyes, and he knew he had to do something. He couldn't let Thorne win. He couldn't let him break this woman who had fought with such quiet courage. He had a plan, a risky, dangerous plan. But it was the only one they had left. The war had just begun. The fire at the O'Connell Ranch was not just an act of arson, it was an act of war. The news of it spread like wildfire through the town, and the residents were divided. Some saw it as another example of Thorne's ruthlessness and a warning to anyone who dared to stand in his way. Others, swayed by Thorne's lies and the whispers of scandal, saw it as a desperate act by a greedy man trying to steal a dead man's land. But for Jack, it was a clear sign that he had to change his strategy. He had been playing defense, and it had cost him. He couldn't just stand back and watch Thorne destroy everything. He had to go on the offensive. The next morning, Jack, with Sarah by his side, rode into town. The air was thick with tension. People stared at them, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Sarah held her head high, her eyes a steely determination that belied the grief she felt inside. She would not let them see her break. They went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a kind face and a weary expression, listened to their story. He knew of Thorne's ruthlessness, but he was a man of the law. "Jack," he said, his voice filled with regret, "I know Thorne's a bad man, but I can't do anything without proof. A fire in the middle of nowhere. It could have been an accident. You know that." "It wasn't an accident," Jack said, his voice firm. "We saw his men at my ranch. We saw the smoke from his fire. This is a deliberate act of war." "I can't just ride out there and arrest him, Jack," the sheriff said. "He's a powerful man. He has a lot of influence in this town." Jack knew he was right. Thorne had the law in his pocket. He was a man who played by his own rules. Jack realized he couldn't fight this battle with the law. He had to fight it on his own terms. He and Sarah left the sheriff's office, the weight of their failure heavy on their shoulders. But Jack had a plan. He had to build his own army. He went to the saloon, a place he rarely frequented, and ordered a whiskey. The saloon was filled with the usual suspects, dusty ranchers and tired townsfolk. The air was thick with the smell of whiskey and stale beer. Thorne's foreman, Jed, was there, his face a smug, victorious grin. He saw Jack and sneered. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in, the hero of the valley. Did you come here to celebrate your loss, Carter?" Jack ignored him. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the men he knew. He saw the doubt, the fear, and the anger. He knew they were all tired of Thorne's reign of terror. He stood up, his voice a quiet but powerful force that cut through the noise of the saloon. "Friends," he said, "I know what you're thinking. You've heard the rumors, you've heard what Thorne has to say, but I want to tell you the truth. Thorne burned down Sarah's ranch. He's trying to take her land, and he's not going to stop there. He's a man who wants to own everything. He wants to own your land, your businesses, your lives. Jed laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He's lying, he sneered. He's just trying to save his own skin. Am I? Jack said, his eyes fixed on Jed. I'm not the one who's been cutting fences and rustling cattle. I'm not the one who's been threatening innocent people. Jed, you know the truth. You saw what happened. You were there. Jed's smugness faltered. He knew Jack was right. The other men in the saloon who had been silent were now listening intently. They had all been affected by Thorne's cruelty, and they were all tired of it. I'm not asking for a fight, Jack continued. I'm asking for your help. I'm asking you to stand with me. To stand with Sarah. To show Thorne that he can't just take what he wants. He can't just burn down our homes and our lives. We have to stand together or we'll all fall. A quiet man from the back of the saloon, a rancher named Frank, stood up. He had lost a few head of cattle to Thorne's men just last week. I'm with you, Jack, he said, his voice firm. Another man stood up, then another. The room was filled with a quiet murmur of assent. They were not a large army, but they were a determined one. They were men who had been pushed to their breaking point. Jed, seeing the tide turning, backed away slowly. He knew he was outnumbered. He knew he was no match for a united front. He and his men left the saloon, a look of shocked defeat on their faces. Jack watched them go, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. He had started a war, but this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. He had an army, a small one, but an army of honorable men. The whispers of trust had become a roar of defiance, and the war for the O'Connell Ranch was about to become a war for the soul of the valley. With a new alliance forged, Jack and his men began to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. The mood at the Lazy J was no longer one of passive defense. It was a mood of quiet determination, a shared sense of purpose. The ranchers who had joined their cause were a motley crew, but they were all men who had been wronged by Thorne, and they were all ready to fight back. They spent the next few days preparing. They stockpiled supplies, checked their weapons, and planned their strategy. The plan was simple. They would go to Thorne's ranch and demand an end to his harassment. They wouldn't start a fight, but they would be ready for one. Sarah was a quiet but powerful presence throughout the preparations. She had lost her home, but she had not lost her spirit. Her grief had been replaced by a fierce resolve. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior. She insisted on being part of the group, and Jack, seeing the fire in her eyes, didn't argue. He knew that this was her fight as much as it was his. The day of the confrontation was hot and still, the air thick with the dust of their horses' hooves. They rode as a silent, formidable unit, a small army of honest men, their faces grim and their purpose clear. The ride to Thorne's ranch was long, but they rode with a quiet sense of purpose. Thorne's ranch was a sprawling, well-maintained fortress, a testament to his ill-gotten gains. The main house was a grand two-story affair, and the corrals and barns were immaculate. It was a stark contrast to the small, humble ranches that dotted the valley. Thorne was waiting for them. He stood on the porch of his house, his face a mask of smug arrogance. Jed and a small army of his own men were standing behind him, their hands resting on their guns. Thorne had clearly been expecting them. "Well, well," Thorne said, a cruel, mocking smile on his face. "Look what we have here, a posse of good old boys. Did you all come to ask for a loan, Carter? I'm afraid my interest rates are a little high." Jack dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the front of the group, his eyes fixed on Thorne. "We're not here for a loan, Thorne," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're here to tell you to stop. The fires, the fence cutting, the cattle rustling. It ends now. The O'Connell Ranch is not for sale. It belongs to Sarah." Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The O'Connell Ranch?" he said. "It's a pile of ash, Carter, a worthless piece of land, and you're a fool for fighting over it." He looked at Sarah, a vicious sneer on his face. "I'll give you $1 for the ashes, ma'am. That's more than it's worth." Sarah, her face a mask of cold fury, dismounted and walked forward. She stood beside Jack, her posture straight and her eyes unwavering. "The land may be ashes, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "But my husband's legacy lives on, and you will not take it from me." Thorne's smile vanished. He had not anticipated her defiance. He had been so used to seeing her as a victim, a helpless woman. "You're a proud woman, ma'am," he said, his voice laced with venom. "But pride is a luxury you can't afford. You're in debt to Carter, for a piece of land that's now worthless. You're a fool just like him." "I may be a fool," Sarah said, her voice a low growl, "but I'm not a thief, I'm not a coward, and I'm not a monster like you." The words hit Thorne like a physical blow. His face darkened with fury. He raised his hand, a signal to his men. "Get them off my land," he commanded, "now." The two sides were now in a standoff. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken threat of violence. The men on both sides had their hands on their guns, their eyes fixed on their opponents. But just as the standoff was about to erupt into a bloody gunfight, a voice from the back of Jack's group called out, "Thorne, we've had enough. You've taken everything from us. Our land, our livelihoods, our peace. It ends now." The voice was a roar of defiance, and it was echoed by the other men in Jack's group. Thorne's men, hearing the anger and the determination in their voices, began to waver. They were not a loyal army. They were just hired thugs. They saw that Jack's men were not afraid, and they knew that they were facing a force they couldn't control. Jed, seeing the fear in his men's eyes, knew he was in a losing battle. He looked at Thorne, a silent message passing between them. Thorne, seeing the fear in Jed's eyes, knew he had been defeated, not by a single man, but by a united front. "This isn't over, Carter," Thorne said, his voice filled with a defeated fury. "This isn't over." With a final venomous glance, he turned and went inside his house. His men, seeing their leader's defeat, slowly backed away and went to their separate quarters. The confrontation was over. The violence had been averted for now. But the war was far from over. Jack and his men rode away, a silent victory in their hearts. They had faced down a bully and they had won. They had stood together, and they had shown him that they would not be broken. The fight for the O'Connell Ranch was no longer just a fight for land. It was a fight for the soul of the valley. The victory over Thorne was a quiet one, but it was a victory nonetheless. The ranchers who had stood with Jack were now his friends, bound by a shared sense of defiance and a newfound respect for each other. The word of their bravery spread through the valley, and Thorne's reputation as a ruthless, untouchable baron was now tarnished. He was no longer a feared figure. He was a man who had been defeated by a handful of honest men. Back at the Lazy J, the atmosphere was one of quiet celebration. The men, their faces tired but triumphant, gathered around a fire, their voices low and filled with a sense of accomplishment. Sarah and Maggie, their hearts filled with a quiet pride, watched them, a sense of belonging settling over them. But the victory was a small one. The O'Connell Ranch was still a pile of ashes, and the debt was still a heavy weight on their shoulders. That evening, Jack found Sarah sitting on the porch, a pensive look on her face. "Are you thinking about the ranch?" he asked, his voice soft. She nodded. "I don't know what to do, Jack. The land is just so empty. It's just a field of black and grey. It's not a home anymore." "It's a beginning," Jack said, his voice firm. "It's a clean slate. We'll rebuild it. We'll make it a home again." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet despair. "How?" "The debt. It's too much. The fires, the sabotage. We've lost so much. I don't know if we can ever pay it off." Jack sat beside her, the firelight casting a warm glow on his face. "We're not going to pay it off, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. Sarah's eyes widened. "What?" "The debt. It's paid," Jack said. "It's paid with honor. It's paid with what you did today. You stood up to him. You stood up to a man who has terrified this valley for years. You fought for your home, and you won. That's worth more than any sum of money." Sarah was speechless. She looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of shock and gratitude. "Jack," she said, her voice a whisper, "you can't do that. It's too much." "It's not," he said. "It's the right thing to do. You deserve to have your land back. You deserve to have your home back. And I'm going to help you rebuild it." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, and she reached out and took his hand. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you so much." He just nodded, a small, tired smile on his face. He was a man who was uncomfortable with grand gestures, but he was a man who knew what was right. The next morning, the ranchers who had stood with him returned. They brought with them not just their support, but their tools, their wagons, and their expertise. They were no longer just a group of men. They were a community. They were here to help rebuild the O'Connell Ranch. The work was long and hard, but it was a labor of love. The men worked side by side, their voices filled with a quiet camaraderie. They rebuilt the barn, they mended the fences, and they cleared the land of the ashes. Sarah and Maggie worked alongside them, their hands calloused and their faces tired, but their hearts were filled with a sense of purpose. As the days turned into weeks, the O'Connell Ranch began to rise from the ashes. A new cabin was built, stronger and more beautiful than the old one. The fences were reinforced, and the land was tilled and prepared for planting. The air, once filled with the smell of smoke, was now filled with the promise of new life. And in the evenings, as the sun set, Sarah and Jack would sit on the porch of the new cabin, watching the stars appear one by one. The silence between them was no longer one of grief or despair. It was a silence filled with a quiet understanding, with a deep affection that had been forged in the fires of adversity. The war with Thorne was far from over. He was a man who would not forget, and he would not forgive, but he had been defeated, and they had won. They had won their dignity, their freedom, and their home. The O'Connell Ranch was no longer just a piece of land. It was a testament to their resilience, to their quiet courage, and to the power of a community that had come together to fight for what was right. The new O'Connell Ranch was a testament to the strength of community. The ranchers who had stood with Jack had poured their time and energy into the rebuilding, and the result was a place that felt not just new, but sacred. It was a place born of defiance and friendship, a symbol of hope in a valley overshadowed by Thorne's malice. As the weeks turned into months, the work of rebuilding was completed. The new cabin, with its sturdy walls and warm fireplace, was a true home. The barn was a solid, well-built structure, and the fences were strong and straight. Sarah and Maggie, with the help of their neighbors, had created a new life from the ashes of their old one. The bond between Sarah and Jack had deepened during this time. The shared hardship had a way of stripping away pretense and revealing the truth of a person. Sarah saw Jack not just as a kind man, but as a man of profound integrity. He was a man of action, of quiet strength, and his presence in her life was a constant source of comfort. And Jack in turn saw Sarah not just as a grieving widow, but as a woman of incredible courage and resilience. He saw the fire in her eyes, the quiet determination that had fueled her through the darkest of days. He saw her as a woman who had lost everything and had still found the strength to rebuild. He found himself thinking about her constantly, about her quiet smile, her tired hands, and her unwavering spirit. One evening, after a long day of working the fields, Sarah found him sitting on the porch of the new cabin. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the land. She sat beside him, the silence between them a comfortable, familiar thing. "The work is finished," she said, her voice soft. "We're home again." "It's a beautiful place, Sarah," Jack said, his voice a low rumble. "You should be proud." "I am," she said, "but I couldn't have done it without you. You gave us a chance. You gave us a home, you gave us everything." He didn't say anything, he just looked at her, his eyes filled with an unreadable expression. Sarah, in that moment, felt a surge of emotion. It was a mixture of gratitude, of affection, and of something else, something she was too afraid to name. She reached out and took his hand, her touch a silent acknowledgement of her feelings. Jack's hand, calloused and rough from years of ranch work, gently squeezed hers. The touch was a quiet, powerful thing, a silent conversation between two people who had been through so much. He turned to her, and she saw in his eyes a depth of feeling she had only dared to dream of. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, hesitant whisper. But he was interrupted. The sound of a horse galloping up the road, its hooves a frantic rhythm, broke the silence. It was one of the ranchers who had helped them, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Jack," he said, his voice breathless. "It's Thorne. He's back. He's at the courthouse in town. He's doing something." The moment was gone. The fragile, unspoken connection that had been building between them was shattered by the harsh reality of their world. Thorne was not a man who would accept defeat. He was a man who would find a new way to win. The war was far from over. Jack's face hardened, his eyes filled with a cold resolve. He was no longer a man in love. He was a warrior. He stood up, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "We'll go," he said, his voice firm. "We'll go and see what he's up to." Sarah stood beside him, her hand still in his, a silent promise to stand with him, no matter what. The whispers of love, of a future they had only just begun to imagine, were now a distant murmur. The reality of their world was a constant battle, a constant struggle for survival, and they were ready to fight it. The ride into town was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Jack, Sarah, and a small group of their fellow ranchers rode in silence, their faces grim. Thorne's defeat had been a powerful victory, but they knew it was only a temporary setback for a man who saw no limits to his power. When they arrived at the courthouse, they were met with a scene that was both baffling and unsettling. Thorne was there, but he was not alone. He was standing with a group of men in suits, city men, their faces grim and their expressions cold. And Thorne had a document in his hand. "Carter," Thorne said, a smug, victorious smile on his face. "Just the man I wanted to see. I see you've rebuilt your little shack, but you've wasted your time and your money because this land, it's not yours anymore, it's mine." Jack's jaw tightened. "What are you talking about, Thorne?" "I'm talking about progress, Carter," Thorne said, his voice filled with a self-satisfied arrogance. "I've gone to the state government. I've petitioned them to build a railroad line right through this valley, and I've been given a grant to buy all the land along the route." He unrolled a large map, and Jack saw to his horror a thin red line that ran directly through the heart of the valley, a line that ran right through his ranch, and a line that ran directly through the O'Connell ranch. "This land is worthless for ranching," Thorne said, his voice filled with a mocking contempt. "But it's perfect for a railroad, and I'm going to own it all. The state will compensate you for your land, Carter, but you'll be paid a fair market price for worthless ranch land. And then you'll have to sell and you'll have nowhere to go." The reality of his plan hit Jack like a physical blow. Thorne had found a new weapon, a legal one. He was not just a bully anymore, he was a businessman. He was using the law to take everything from them. Sarah, her face pale, looked at the map. She saw the red line, a scar running through the heart of her home. The debt to Jack, which he had so graciously forgiven, now felt like an impossible burden. They had rebuilt their home, but now it was to be taken from them again. "You can't do this, Thorne," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "You can't just take people's land." "I can, Carter," Thorne said, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Because the law says I can. The state has declared this land to be for public use. It's progress, Carter. You can't fight progress." The ranchers who had stood with Jack were now silent, their faces filled with a defeated despair. They had stood up to Thorne, but they couldn't stand up to the law. Jack looked at Sarah, at the look of defeat in her eyes. He had promised her he would not let her lose her home, and now he was powerless to stop it. He had fought a man, but he couldn't fight a law. "This isn't over, Thorne," Jack said, his voice a quiet promise. "This isn't over." "It is, Carter," Thorne said, a smug, victorious smile on his face. "It's over, and you've lost. Again." He and his men left the courthouse, their victory a bitter taste in Jack's mouth. He had been so focused on fighting a physical war that he had been blindsided by a legal one. He had been so sure of his moral righteousness, and Thorne had used his own rules against him. That night, back at the Lazy J, the air was heavy with despair. The ranchers who had stood with Jack were now scattered, their faces grim with the knowledge of their impending defeat. The war was over, and Thorne had won. Jack sat on the porch of the main house, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He had fought hard, he had stood up for what was right, and in the end, it was all for nothing. He had lost the O'Connell ranch, and he was about to lose his own. Sarah came and sat beside him. She put a gentle hand on his arm. "Jack," she said, her voice soft, It's not your fault. You did everything you could. I promised you, Sarah, he said, his voice raw with a bitter regret. I promised you that I wouldn't let you lose your home, and I failed. You didn't fail, she said, her voice firm. You gave us a chance. You gave us hope. And you gave us a family. That's worth more than any land. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a new kind of despair. He had lost the battle for the land, but he was not going to lose the battle for her heart. He was not going to let Thorne take everything from him. The war was far from over, and this time he would not be fighting with his fists, he would be fighting with his mind, and he would not stop until he won. The defeat was a bitter pill to swallow. The ranchers who had rallied behind Jack were now facing the same fate, losing their land for a paltry sum. Thorne's legal maneuver was a brilliant, malicious stroke of genius, and there was seemingly no way to fight it. The law was on his side. Jack, a man who had always been a leader, now felt the weight of his failure. The ranchers who had trusted him had lost their homes because of his promises. The silence on the Lazy J was heavy with despair, and the once vibrant community was now a shadow of its former self. But despair was a luxury they couldn't afford. Jack knew that sitting around and feeling sorry for themselves was exactly what Thorne wanted. He had to find a way to fight back. He had to find a loophole, a way to use the law against Thorne. He spent the next few days in the small office in his house, poring over legal documents, his face grim and his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He read about railroad grants, land rights, and eminent domain. He was a rancher, not a lawyer, but he was a man who could learn. Sarah, a quiet but constant presence, would bring him coffee and food, her hands gentle as she placed the tray on his desk. She didn't say anything. She just let him work. She knew that he had to fight this battle on his own. After a few days of tireless research, Jack found it. A small, obscure clause in the Railroad Act that Thorne had used. It stated that the railroad had to be a public utility and that the land it used had to be for the public good. It was a vague but potentially powerful loophole. Jack had a plan, a desperate, risky plan, but it was the only one they had left. He had to prove that Thorne's railroad was not a public utility, but a private enterprise, a personal venture to get rich and to consolidate his power. He went to the ranchers who had stood with him, their faces weary and defeated. He laid out his plan to them. He told them that they had to go to the state capitol, to the railroad commissioner, and to the governor. They had to tell their story. They had to show them that Thorne's railroad was not for the public good, but for his own personal gain. The ranchers were hesitant. It was a long, expensive trip, and they had already lost so much. But Jack, his voice filled with a quiet passion, spoke to them of honor, of fighting for what was right and of not letting a bully win. "We may lose," he said, his voice firm, "but at least we'll lose with our heads held high. We'll show them that we're not just a bunch of broken ranchers. We're men who fight for our homes and our families." His words, a testament to his unwavering spirit, were enough. The ranchers, seeing the fire in his eyes, agreed. They would go to the capital. They would fight for what was right. The trip was a long and arduous one. They traveled by wagon, their supplies sparse and their spirits low, but they were a determined crew, and they were united in their purpose. Jack, a natural leader, kept their spirits up, reminding them of why they were fighting. As they traveled, Sarah found herself growing closer to him. She saw him not just as a leader, but as a man of great character. He was a man who, despite his own pain, was willing to fight for others. He was a man who, despite his own failure, was willing to stand up for what was right. One evening, as they sat around a campfire, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low whisper, if we win, I want to talk to you. About us, about our future, about a life together." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been so consumed by the fight that she had forgotten about the unspoken love that had been growing between them. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I know it's a desperate plan, Jack," she said, her voice soft, "but it's a plan that's worth fighting for. And so are you, and so am I, and so are we." He smiled, a rare and genuine expression. He knew then that he had a new reason to fight. He was no longer just fighting for the land. He was fighting for a future, for a life, for a family. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he knew he would win, because he had something to fight for, something more precious than any land. He had love, and with love, there was always hope. The journey to the state capital was long and arduous. The dusty road stretched out before them like a thin brown ribbon, a constant reminder of the distance they had to travel. The small caravan of wagons, filled with weary men and their meager supplies, was a testament to their unwavering determination. They were a small army, a band of brothers united by a common enemy, and their leader was Jack Carter. Jack, a man who had always been a quiet leader, was now a beacon of hope. He would ride at the front of the caravan, his silhouette a stark, resolute figure against the endless sky. He would spend his evenings by the campfire talking to the men, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. He spoke not just of their plan, but of the honor of their fight. He reminded them that they were not just fighting for their land, but for their way of life. They were fighting for the right to be honest and to be free. Sarah and Maggie were a constant presence. They rode in a small wagon, their faces a mix of hope and fear. Sarah, a woman who had been so consumed by grief, was now filled with a quiet sense of purpose. She would spend her days talking to the men, her voice a soft, comforting presence. She spoke of her husband, of his love for the land and of her promise to him. She reminded them that their fight was not just for them, but for the legacy of a good man. Maggie, a young girl who had been forced to grow up too soon, was now a young woman of incredible strength. She would spend her days with the horses, her gentle touch a constant source of calm in the midst of their weary journey. She would talk to them, her voice a low, soothing murmur, and the horses would respond, their ears pricked forward, their eyes filled with a quiet trust. The journey was a crucible, a test of their endurance and their resolve. But with each passing day, their bond grew stronger. The men who had been strangers were now friends, sharing stories, laughter, and a deep, unspoken respect for each other. They were a family of sorts, a small, tight-knit community in the middle of a vast and unforgiving landscape. The nights were cold and filled with the lonely cry of the coyote. The days were hot and filled with the dust of the road. But they kept going, fueled by a deep-seated sense of justice and a fierce resolve to win. As they drew closer to the capital, the landscape began to change. The endless plains gave way to rolling hills, and the dusty road became a well-worn path. They saw the signs of a bustling, modern world, a world that was a stark contrast to the quiet, simple life they had left behind. The capital was a bustling, chaotic place. The streets were filled with people, their faces a blur of movement and noise. The buildings, tall and imposing, were a testament to the power of a world that was far removed from their quiet, simple lives. The ranchers, a group of dusty, weary men, were a jarring sight in the midst of the city's chaos. They found a small boarding house on the outskirts of town, a quiet refuge from the city's noise. They spent the next few days preparing their case. Jack, with the help of Sarah, worked tirelessly, putting together their story, their evidence, and their argument. He was not a lawyer, but he was a man of logic, and he was a man who knew the truth. The day of the meeting with the railroad commissioner was a tense one. The office was a grand, imposing room filled with the trappings of power. The commissioner was a stern, unsmiling man, his face a mask of official indifference. He listened to their story, his expression unchanged. Jack spoke first, his voice firm and unwavering. He spoke of Thorne's ruthlessness, of his lies, and of his reign of terror. He spoke of the O'Connell Ranch, of the fire, and of the community that had come together to rebuild it. He spoke of Thorne's railroad, of his legal maneuvers, and of his true intentions. He spoke not just of Thorne's greed, but of his evil. The other ranchers, one by one, spoke their truth. They spoke of lost cattle, of cut fences, of ruined livelihoods. They spoke of their families, of their homes, and of their deep-seated fear of Thorne. They were not polished speakers, but their words were filled with a raw, honest power that was far more convincing than any legal jargon. When they were finished, the commissioner sat in silence, his face unreadable. He looked from Jack to Sarah, and then to the other ranchers. He saw the truth in their eyes. He saw the pain, the fear, and the unwavering resolve. Finally, he spoke. "Your story," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble. "It's a powerful one. But Thorne's railroad, it's a legal document. It's a matter of public good." "It's not for the public good, sir," Jack said, his voice firm. "It's for the good of one man, one evil man." The commissioner looked at him, his eyes filled with a new expression, an expression of respect. "I will look into this," he said. "I will investigate, but I can't promise you anything. This is a powerful man you're up against, and he has a lot of influence." The meeting was over. They had done everything they could. They had told their story. Now they had to wait. The journey to justice was not over, it was just beginning, and they were ready to fight it to the very end. The days that followed the meeting at the Capitol were a tense, nerve-wracking waiting game. Jack and his small army of ranchers were trapped in a state of suspended animation, their fate hanging in the balance. The city, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a cage, a place where their future was being decided without their consent. But Thorne, a master of psychological warfare, was not a man to sit still. He had his own spies in the city, and he knew what they had done. He knew that they had told their story, and he knew that they had to be silenced. He began to spread his own rumors. He sent men to the city, men with well-tailored suits and smooth, practiced lies. They would go to the newspapers, to the saloons, to the halls of power, and they would tell a different story. They would tell a story of a greedy rancher, a broken man who had lost his mind, and a desperate widow who would do anything for money. They would tell a story of a man who was trying to stop progress, to ruin a great man, and to destroy a great project. The newspapers, eager for a good scandal, picked up the story. The headlines were filled with Thorne's lies. The people of the city who had been so kind now looked at them with a mixture of suspicion and pity. The whispers followed them everywhere they went. Sarah felt the weight of the rumors more than anyone. She saw the glances, the whispers, the cold looks that were directed at her. The shame of her past desperation, which she had thought she had overcome, was now a public spectacle. The words that Thorne had used against her so long ago were now being used against her again, in a place she had never been, and by people she had never met. She would spend her days in the quiet boarding house, her face a mask of silent pain. She felt a profound sense of failure. She had tried so hard to fight for her home, and in the end, she had just brought more trouble and more shame. Jack, seeing her despair, was filled with a cold rage. He was a man who could fight with his fists, but he was powerless to fight a whisper. He knew that Thorne was not just trying to win the legal battle, he was trying to break them, to destroy their spirit. He went to the newspapers, but they would not listen. They had already made up their minds. He went to the railroad commissioner, but the commissioner, a man of politics, told him that he had to be careful. Thorne had a lot of money and a lot of influence, and he was not a man to be trifled with. The situation was desperate. They were out of money, out of options, and a long way from home. The hope that had sustained them on their long journey was now a fragile, flickering flame. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Jack found Sarah sitting in the quiet garden of the boarding house. She was alone, her face a mask of silent grief. He sat beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft, "don't listen to them, they're just lies. Thorne, he's a monster. He'll do anything to win, but he can't win, he can't break us." "He already has, Jack," she said, her voice a whisper. "He's taken everything, our home, our money, and now our reputation. I'm sorry, Jack, I'm so sorry I ever got you into this. I should have just let him have the ranch, I should have just left." "No," Jack said, his voice firm. "Don't you ever say that. Don't you ever think that. You did the right thing, Sarah. You fought for what was yours, and I am proud to have fought with you." He reached out and took her hands, his touch a gentle reassurance. "Listen to me, Sarah," he said, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "The words, the whispers, they don't matter. What matters is the truth. What matters is what we know in our hearts, and we know that we are good people. We know that we are fighting for what is right, and we will not give up. We will not let him win." His words were a comfort, a lifeline in the sea of her despair. She looked at him, and she saw not just a man who was fighting for her, but a man who was fighting for her honor. He was a man who believed in her, even when she had stopped believing in herself. A small spark of hope, a fragile, flickering flame, ignited in her heart. She was not a victim. She was a warrior. She was a woman who had stood up to a monster, and she was not going to give up. Not now, not ever. The Battle of Whispers was a difficult one, but she would fight it with everything she had. She would fight it with her honor. The Battle of Whispers was a frustrating, soul-crushing war. Jack, a man who was used to fighting with his fists, was powerless against the insidious spread of Thorne's lies. The ranchers who had come with him were growing weary. They were running out of money, and they were beginning to lose hope. But Jack was a man who did not give up easily. He knew that Thorne had a weakness. Every man had a weakness. He just had to find it. He began to investigate Thorne's past, his business dealings, his rise to power. He went to the libraries, the government offices, the old newspaper archives. He was a man with a purpose, and he would not rest until he found it. His research led him to a small, unassuming newspaper archive in the heart of the city. He spent days poring over old news stories, his eyes scanning the faded ink for any hint of Thorne's true nature. And then he found it. A small, obscure article buried deep in the archives. It was a story about Thorne's early years, about his first big deal. It was a story about a man who had betrayed his business partner, a man who had stolen his land, his money, and his reputation. The article was a small, insignificant thing, a forgotten piece of history, but it was a key. It was a key to Thorne's past, to his ruthless nature, and to his true intentions. The man who had written the article was a young journalist named Thomas, a name that sounded familiar. Jack went back to his boarding house, his heart pounding with a new kind of hope. He went to Sarah, who was sitting in the quiet garden, her face a mask of weary despair. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with a quiet urgency, "I need to talk to you. About your husband." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and hope. She hadn't heard him talk about her husband in a long time. "What about him, Jack?" "I found something," he said. "I found an article he wrote a long time ago. It's about Thorne, about his past, about how he got his start. It's about a man he betrayed." Sarah's eyes widened with a sudden, dawning comprehension. He was a journalist," she said. "He never told me." "He was," Jack said. "A young man, full of fire and a sense of justice. He wrote about Thorne's first big deal, about how he took everything from a man named Silas Thorne." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Thorne. He changed his name," she said, her voice a whisper. "He was a different man back then." "He was," Jack said. "But the article, it's a key, it's proof. Proof of his true nature. Proof that he is a man who will do anything to get what he wants. And the man he betrayed, his name was Silas." Sarah's mind was reeling. Her husband had known Thorne's secret. He had known about his past. He had known about the man he had betrayed, the man who had a son who was still alive, a son who was the true heir to Thorne's fortune. The truth was now a terrible, glorious thing. Thorne's railroad was not just a legal maneuver. It was a way to consolidate his power, to ensure that the secrets of his past would remain buried. Jack had a plan, a desperate, risky, but brilliant plan. He would not just fight Thorne with the law. He would fight him with his own past. He would find the true heir to Thorne's fortune, and he would use him to expose Thorne's lies. The search for the true heir was a long and arduous one. Jack and Sarah worked together, their bond now a silent, powerful force. They went to old towns, they talked to old people, they followed a trail of clues that was a forgotten piece of history. And finally, they found him. A quiet, unassuming man, living a simple life in a small town. His name was Silas, just like his father. He was a man who had been a victim of Thorne's greed, a man who had been cheated out of his inheritance, and a man who had a deep, unyielding sense of justice. The meeting with Silas was a quiet, tense one. Jack and Sarah told him their story, their voices filled with a quiet passion. They showed him the article, the proof of his father's betrayal, and the proof of Thorne's true nature. Silas listened in silence, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. He was a man who had lived his whole life in the shadow of a lie. He was a man who had been a victim, but in that moment, he was a man who had a choice. He could continue to live in the shadow of a lie, or he could stand up for what was right. "I will help you," he said, his voice a quiet but powerful force. "I will help you expose him, for my father's sake, and for justice." The battle was far from over. But now they had a new ally, a secret ally, a man who held the key to Thorne's past and to his future. The war was no longer just about land, it was about truth, and they were ready to fight it to the very end. With Silas as their secret ally, Jack and Sarah devised a final, desperate gambit. They would expose Thorne not just as a greedy land baron, but as a liar and a thief. They would use his own history against him, revealing the sordid truth of his rise to power. They would not just fight him in a courtroom, they would fight him in the court of public opinion. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They would go to the state capital, not to petition the government, but to expose Thorne to the public. They would hold a press conference, a public event where they would tell their story and reveal the truth of Thorne's past. The day of the press conference was a tense, nerve-wracking one. The small town was bustling with reporters, their faces a blur of curiosity and anticipation. Thorne's spies were everywhere, their eyes a cold, menacing presence. Jack, Sarah, and Silas stood on a small stage, their faces a mask of quiet determination. They were a small, unassuming group of people, but they were a force to be reckoned with. They were a force of truth. Jack spoke first, his voice a low, powerful rumble. He spoke of Thorne's railroad, of his legal maneuvers, and of his true intentions. He spoke of his reign of terror, of the fires, the fence-cutting, and the cattle rustling. He spoke not just as a rancher, but as a man who had been wronged. Then he introduced Silas. Silas, a quiet man who had lived his whole life in the shadow of a lie, now stood in the spotlight. He spoke of his father, of his love for the land, and of his betrayal by his former partner, the man who was now known as Silas Thorne. He spoke of the stolen land, the stolen money, and the stolen name. He held up the old newspaper article, the proof of Thorne's crime. The reporters were stunned. They had come for a story of a legal battle, a story of a land dispute. They had found a story of a betrayal, a story of a family torn apart by greed, and a story of a man who had built his empire on a foundation of lies. The press conference was a powerful thing. The truth, once buried, was now a public spectacle. The news spread like wildfire, carried by the telegraph lines to every corner of the state. The truth was now a weapon, and it was a weapon that Thorne could not fight. Thorne, who had been so smug, was now a cornered animal. The rumors, the whispers, the lies he had spread were now turned against him. His allies, his friends, his business partners, who had been so willing to support him, were now silent. They had been lied to, they had been used, and they were not going to stand for it. The railroad commissioner, a man of politics, now had a new perspective. Thorne's railroad was not a public utility. It was a private enterprise, a personal venture to get rich and to consolidate his power. And the man behind it was a liar and a thief. He withdrew his support for Thorne's project, and the project was dead. The victory was a glorious one, but it was a small one. Thorne was not a man who would give up. He was a man who would find a new way to win. The war was far from over. That evening, as the sun set, Jack and Sarah sat on the porch of their new cabin. The air was filled with a sense of peace, a sense of quiet triumph. They had won. They had won their dignity, their home and their future. But the future was still uncertain. Thorne was a man who would not forget, and he would not forgive. He was a man who would seek revenge. The final confrontation was still to come. The final gambit was still to be played. And they were ready to play it. They were ready to fight for their lives and for their love. The final confrontation was a quiet, tense affair. It was not a battle of guns or of law, but a battle of wills. Thorne, a man who had lost everything, was a cornered animal, a dangerous and unpredictable force. He had lost his power, his influence, and his reputation, and he had one thing left, his rage. He rode to the O'Connell ranch, alone. He dismounted, his face a mask of cold, unyielding fury. He stood in the middle of the yard, a silent, menacing presence. Jack, seeing him, walked out of the cabin, his hands at his side. He was a man who was no longer just a rancher. He was a man who had stood up to a monster and had won. "Thorne," he said, his voice a low, unwavering rumble, "this is over. You've lost." "I haven't lost, Carter," Thorne said, his voice a low growl. "I haven't lost a thing. I just have to get rid of you, you and that woman. You're the reason for all of this. You're the reason I've lost everything." "You lost everything because you're a liar and a thief, Thorne," Jack said. "Not because of us." Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury. He reached for his gun, a small silver pistol that was a symbol of his power. "This is how it ends, Carter," he said. "This is how it ends. I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to take this land, and then I'm going to have my revenge." But before he could pull the trigger, a voice called out, "No!" It was Sarah. She stood on the porch of the cabin, a rifle in her hand. She was a woman who had been a victim for so long, but she was a victim no longer. She was a woman who had found her courage and her voice. "Thorne," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength, "put the gun down. This is over. You've lost. You've lost your money, you've lost your friends, and you've lost your reputation. You have nothing left, but we have everything." Thorne looked at her, his eyes filled with a defeated fury. He had been so sure of his power, so sure of his victory. But he had been defeated not by a man, but by a woman. He was a man who had always been a bully, and he was a man who had finally met his match. He looked from Sarah to Jack, and then at the new cabin, the symbol of their victory. He saw the fire in their eyes, the love in their hearts, and the unwavering strength of their bond. He was a man who had lived his life in a world of lies, and he was a man who had finally been defeated by the truth. He slowly lowered his gun, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and defeat. He was a broken man, a man who had lost everything. He got on his horse, and he rode away, a defeated figure against the setting sun. The confrontation was over. The war was over, and they had won. They had won their home, their dignity, and their future. They were no longer a victim and a benefactor. They were two people who had found each other in the midst of a storm, and they had found a love that was stronger than any hardship. The sun set, and the stars began to appear, one by one. The air was filled with a sense of peace, a sense of quiet triumph. The O'Connell Ranch was no longer just a piece of land. It was a testament to their resilience, to their quiet courage, and to the power of a love that had been forged in the fires of adversity. The story was not over. It was just beginning. The defeat of Silas Thorne was a quiet, personal victory. The town, once so divided, was now united in its relief. Thorne was gone, his name a curse on the lips of the people he had wronged. His empire, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled, and the valley was finally at peace. With the threat of Thorne gone, a new rhythm settled over the Lazy J and the O'Connell Ranch. The men, who had been a small army, were now a community, their shared experience a bond that would last a lifetime. They would often gather at the O'Connell Ranch, their voices filled with laughter and a quiet camaraderie, and in the heart of it all were Jack and Sarah. Their unspoken love, which had been a quiet murmur in the midst of the storm, was now a powerful, undeniable force. They were two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and they were two people who were ready to build a life together. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink, Jack found Sarah sitting on the porch of the O'Connell Ranch. The air was filled with the sweet smell of blooming wildflowers, a testament to the new life that had risen from the ashes. He sat beside her, the silence between them a comfortable, familiar thing. He took her hand in his touch a gentle reassurance. "The house is finished," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "The fences are strong. The land is ready for planting. We've won, Sarah, we've won it all." "We did," she said, her voice filled with a quiet sense of triumph. "We did it together." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound love. "Sarah," he said, his voice a quiet, hesitant whisper. "I know this is not the right time, and I know that this is not the right place, but I have to ask you something." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I have a lot of land," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "But it's just a lot of land. It's not a home, not without you. And Maggie. I want to build a home, Sarah. I want to build a family with you. I want to marry you. I want to live the rest of my life with you. I want to spend every day for the rest of my life with you." Sarah was speechless. Tears welled in her eyes, and she reached out and took his hands, her touch a silent, powerful acknowledgement of her feelings. "Jack," she said, her voice a raw whisper. I know," he said, his voice filled with a quiet understanding. "I know. It's too soon. It's too fast. You just lost your husband. I know. But I can't wait. I can't wait another minute. I love you, Sarah. I have loved you since the moment I saw you. I love you more than I have ever loved anyone. I want to be with you for the rest of my life." Sarah's heart was filled with a sense of overwhelming love. She had been through so much and she had lost so much. But in this moment she had found everything. She had found a man who loved her, a man who believed in her, and a man who was willing to fight for her. She had found her home. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and gratitude. "Yes, Jack," she said, her voice a whisper. "Yes, I will marry you." A small, genuine smile touched his lips. He leaned in and he kissed her. It was a kiss that was filled with a quiet passion, a kiss that was a promise of a future filled with love and with hope. The sun set and the stars began to appear, one by one. The air was filled with a sense of peace, a sense of quiet triumph. The O'Connell Ranch was no longer just a piece of land. It was a home. It was a symbol of their love. And it was a symbol of their future. The story was not over. It was just beginning. The wedding was a quiet, intimate affair. It was held at the O'Connell Ranch, on the very land that had been the center of their long, difficult journey. The sun, a warm golden orb in the pale blue sky, cast a gentle glow on the small crowd of ranchers who had come to witness their union. Sarah wore a simple white dress, her face a mask of quiet, radiant happiness. Maggie, her face filled with a quiet pride, stood by her side, a silent testament to the new family that was being formed. Jack, a man who was usually so stoic, was filled with a sense of overwhelming joy. He was a man who had found his purpose, his home, and his heart. The ceremony was a simple, beautiful thing. The words of the preacher were a quiet, powerful testament to their love, to their resilience, and to their unwavering faith. They had been through so much, and in this moment, they had found their peace. As the sun set, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink, Jack and Sarah stood on the porch of their new home, their hands intertwined. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, of music, and of the quiet, familiar rhythm of life on the ranch. Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound love. The cowboy said, "Too high a price for the ranch," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. And the widow answered, offering her daughter too. He smiled, a genuine, loving expression. But the cowboy knew that the price was not in acres of land or in a daughter's hand. It was in a woman's heart. And her heart. Her heart was a price I was willing to pay. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out and took his hands, her touch a silent, powerful acknowledgement of her feelings. "I offered my daughter," she said, her voice a raw whisper, "because I was desperate. I was desperate for a home. I was desperate for a future, and I found it. I found it in you." He leaned in, and he kissed her. It was a kiss that was filled with a quiet passion, a kiss that was a promise of a future filled with love and with hope. The sun set, and the stars began to appear, one by one. The air was filled with a sense of peace, a sense of quiet triumph. The O'Connell Ranch was no longer just a piece of land. It was a home. It was a symbol of their love, and it was a symbol of their future. The story was not over. It was a new chapter, a chapter filled with a quiet love, a strong family, and a promise that was a cowboy's promise, a promise to be a good man, a good husband, and a good father, a promise to be a cowboy, a man who would always stand up for what was right, and a man who would always love his family.